Forests and mountains often promise solitude, challenge, and reward, but they also hide dangers far greater than any trophy on the wall. Hunters venture deep into these wild places with skill and preparation, yet nature rarely follows their rules. In this video, we'll uncover 6 chilling encounters where routine pursuits turned into desperate fights for survival. From a colossal grizzly flipping a truck in Russia's Ussuri Krai to a lone hunter battling wolves during a Montana blizzard, each story exposes how quickly control can vanish in the wild. The remote wilderness of Ussuri Krai had always been a place where civilization felt like a distant memory. This easternmost region of Russia, bordering China and North Korea, contains some of the most pristine and dangerous forests on Earth. Dense Siberian spruce stretched endlessly across rolling hills, broken only by meandering streams and rocky ravines carved by centuries of harsh weather. The area had been a hunting ground for generations of Russian families, though few ventured deep into its interior without significant preparation and respect for the apex predators that called it home. On August 7, 2025, 6 experienced hunters had gathered at dawn near the small settlement of Lazo, their breath visible in the crisp mountain air. Andrei Volkov, a 43-year-old construction foreman from Vladivostok, had organized the expedition. His weathered hands gripped the steering wheel of their modified pickup truck as he navigated the narrow forest road that wound deeper into the wilderness. Beside him sat Mikhail Sidorov, a 38-year-old mechanic whose knowledge of the local terrain made him invaluable on such trips. In the truck bed, Pavel Ivanov and Dmitry Petrov checked their equipment one final time. Pavel, a stocky 41-year-old logger, had brought his trusted .338 Winchester Magnum, while Dmitry, 35 and lean from years of outdoor work, carried a .308 Ruger that had belonged to his grandfather. Yuri Kolesnikov, the eldest at 47, sat with his .30.06 Springfield across his lap, its worn stock bearing the scratches and dents of countless successful hunts. The youngest member of their group, 24-year-old Alexei Nazarov, clutched his newly purchased hunting rifle nervously, still learning the ways of the forest from these seasoned veterans. The group had been tracking a herd of red deer for 3 hours, following fresh tracks and droppings along the winding dirt path. Their plan was straightforward: locate the herd during their morning feeding, position themselves strategically, and take clean shots that would provide meat for their families through the coming winter months. The morning had been unusually quiet, with only the occasional call of ravens overhead and the distant sound of rushing water from hidden streams. Andrei downshifted as the truck climbed a particularly steep section of the road, where thick spruce branches scraped against the vehicle's sides. The narrow track, barely wide enough for their pickup, had been carved out by logging crews decades earlier, and was now used primarily by hunters and the occasional research team studying the region's wildlife. On either side, the forest pressed in densely, creating a green tunnel that blocked most of the morning sunlight. Mikhail pointed through the windshield toward a clearing ahead where fresh deer tracks crisscrossed the muddy ground. Andrei slowed the truck to examine the signs more closely, noting the size and depth of the hoof prints that indicated a substantial herd had passed through recently. The men began preparing their rifles, checking ammunition, and adjusting scopes for the anticipated encounter. What none of them realized was that they were entering territory recently claimed by one of the largest grizzly bears ever recorded in the region. The massive predator, weighing approximately 1,700 pounds and standing nearly 9 feet tall on its hind legs, had been feeding on an elk carcass hidden in the dense underbrush just 50 yards from the road. The bear's exceptional size was the result of an unusually abundant salmon run the previous autumn, combined with its dominant position over several prime feeding territories. The first sign of danger came as a low, rumbling growl that seemed to emanate from the forest itself. Yuri, whose experienced ears had detected countless wildlife sounds over the decades, immediately recognized the threat. He shouted a warning to his companions, but his words were drowned out by an earth-shaking roar as the enormous grizzly exploded from the spruce thicket with terrifying speed. The bear's charge was a display of raw power that defied belief. Its massive form crashed through saplings and underbrush as if they were mere twigs, covering the distance to the road in less than 4 seconds. Andre yanked the steering wheel hard to the right, desperately trying to avoid the collision, but the bear's momentum carried it directly into the truck's left side with devastating force. The impact lifted the entire vehicle off the ground. Metal crumpled like paper as the bear's 1,700-pound mass struck the truck bed where Pavel and Dmitry were seated. Both men were thrown violently from the vehicle as it flipped sideways, tumbling down the steep embankment toward the ravine below. Their rifles flew in different directions, disappearing into the thick undergrowth along with their backpacks and survival gear. Inside the cab, Andre and Mikhail were pinned as the truck rolled twice before slamming into a cluster of birch trees. The windshield shattered, filling the air with glittering fragments, while the engine block shifted forward, crushing Andre's legs against the dashboard. Mikhail managed to kick open the passenger door and crawl free, blood streaming from a deep gash across his forehead. The Grizzly, now even more enraged by the collision and the alien sense of gasoline and metal, turned its attention to the scattered hunters. Its massive claws, each longer than a man's finger, raked across Pavel's back as he attempted to crawl toward his fallen rifle. The logger's heavy jacket provided little protection against the bear's incredible strength, tearing like tissue paper as razor-sharp talons found flesh and bone beneath. Dmitry had landed hard against a boulder, his right shoulder dislocated and his ribs sending waves of agony through his chest with each labored breath. He watched in helpless terror as the bear methodically moved between the fallen hunters, its dark eyes reflecting an intelligence that made the attack even more chilling. The predator seemed to understand that these intruders represented a threat to its territory, and it was determined to eliminate that threat completely. Yuri had been thrown clear of the truck during the initial impact, landing in a patch of soft moss that likely saved his life. However, his .3006 was nowhere to be seen, buried somewhere beneath the wreckage or lost in the dense vegetation. He attempted to reach Mikhail, who was struggling to extract Andre from the crushed cab, but the bear's attention was fixed on his movement. The Grizzly's second charge was even more devastating than its attack on the vehicle. Yuri managed to dodge the initial swipe, but the bear's backhand caught him across the chest, sending him flying into a tree trunk with enough force to crack several ribs. The older hunter collapsed, gasping for air as the predator loomed over him, saliva dripping from jaws capable of crushing bone with ease. Young Alexei had been the fortunate exception during the chaos. The truck's violent tumble had launched him through the air in a different trajectory, landing him behind a large granite boulder that provided both cover and concealment. From his hiding place, he witnessed the systematic destruction of his hunting party, powerless to intervene as the massive grizzly moved from victim to victim with terrifying efficiency. The bear's attack continued for what felt like hours but lasted perhaps 10 minutes. When the forest finally fell silent except for the hiss of steam from the truck's punctured radiator, 5 of the 6 hunters lay motionless among the scattered debris. Only Alexei remained conscious, his body racked with pain from internal injuries and his mind struggling to process the brutality he had witnessed. The Grizzly spent several more minutes investigating the overturned vehicle, its massive head disappearing briefly into the cab before emerging with pieces of their food supplies. Satisfied that the immediate threat had been eliminated, the enormous predator gradually retreated into the dense forest, leaving behind a scene of utter devastation. Alexei waited until the forest sounds returned to normal before emerging from his hiding place. His left arm hung useless at his side, and each step sent lightning bolts of pain through his injured spine, but survival instincts drove him forward. The young hunter would spend the next 18 hours crawling and stumbling through the wilderness before reaching the nearest settlement, carrying with him the horrific memory of nature's ultimate demonstration of power and the knowledge that in the deepest wilderness, humans remained merely visitors in a domain ruled by creatures far more powerful than any rifle could challenge. In early October 2018, the wilderness of northwestern Montana had witnessed countless hunting expeditions over the decades, but few locations commanded as much respect from experienced hunters as the treacherous terrain surrounding the South Fork Sun River system. This particular stretch of forest, characterized by steep granite cliffs and rushing rapids that carved through ancient rock formations, had earned its reputation through a combination of abundant wildlife and equally abundant danger. The river itself dropped nearly 200 feet over a series of cascading waterfalls and rocky chutes, creating a thunderous roar that could be heard for miles through the dense pine forest. 3 seasoned hunters had ventured into this challenging landscape on a crisp October morning when the autumn air carried the sharp scent of approaching winter. Ethan Caldwell, a 39-year-old outfitter from Kalispell, led the expedition with his .300 Winchester Magnum secured across his broad shoulders. His weathered face and steady gait spoke of countless hours spent navigating Montana's most demanding terrain, hunting everything from white-tailed deer to massive bull elk. Marcus Reed, 34 and built like the former college linebacker he had been, carried his grandfather's .308 Ruger with the reverence of someone who understood its history. The rifle had taken dozens of elk over 3 generations, and Marcus intended to continue that tradition during this particular hunt. His knowledge of elk behavior during the rutting season made him an invaluable partner for tracking the massive bulls that frequented this region during mating season. The third member of their party was Jenna Ortiz, 28 and one of the most skilled hunters in the area despite her relative youth. Her .270 Winchester had proven its effectiveness on numerous occasions, and her ability to move silently through dense undergrowth had earned her the respect of hunters twice her age. She had grown up in these mountains learning to read animal sign and weather patterns from her father and grandfather before most children learned to drive. The trio had been tracking a particularly impressive bull elk since before sunrise, following a trail of rutted earth and broken branches that indicated an animal of exceptional size moving through the forest. The bull's tracks measured nearly 6 inches long, suggesting a mature animal that would weigh close to 800 pounds and carry antlers spanning at least 5 feet across. Their pursuit had led them to the edge of the rushing rapids, where the elk's trail seemed to vanish into the churning water. Ethan knelt beside the muddy bank, examining the deep impressions where the bull had apparently entered the river. The tracks showed no signs of hesitation, indicating that the massive animal had plunged directly into the dangerous current without regard for the jagged rocks and powerful undertow that made this particular crossing so treacherous. Marcus positioned himself upstream, scanning the opposite bank for any sign of where the elk might have emerged from the water. The roar of the rapids made communication difficult, forcing the hunters to rely on hand signals as they spread out along the river's edge. Jenna moved downstream, her experienced eyes searching for the telltale marks that would indicate the bull's exit point. The attack came without warning, as the massive elk burst from the forest on the far side of the river, followed by a stampede of cows and younger bulls that had been driven into a panic by some unseen threat. The lead bull, its impressive antlers catching the filtered sunlight, plunged directly into the icy rapids with a tremendous splash that sent water cascading in all directions. Marcus stepped forward for a better vantage point, placing his boot on what appeared to be a stable boulder. The rock, made treacherous by a coating of wet moss and algae, immediately shifted beneath his weight. His arms windmilled desperately as he fought to maintain his balance, but the slippery surface offered no purchase. He tumbled backward into the rushing water with a shout of alarm that was immediately swallowed by the river's thunderous voice. The icy mountain water shocked Marcus's system as the current seized him, pulling him toward the jagged rocks that jutted from the riverbed like ancient teeth. His heavy hunting clothes, designed for warmth in the mountain air, became waterlogged and dragged him deeper beneath the surface. The .308 Ruger disappeared into the murky depths, lost forever to the powerful current. Ethan reacted instantly, firing a warning shot from his .300 Winchester Magnum toward the elk herd. The sharp crack echoed off the canyon walls as he attempted to redirect the animals away from his drowning companion. The bull elk, startled by the sudden noise, veered sharply downstream but continued its dangerous crossing, followed by the rest of the panicked herd. Jenna dropped her rifle and lunged toward the water's edge, her hand extended toward Marcus as he struggled against the current. She managed to grab his jacket sleeve just as a young bull elk, swept along by the same current, collided with both of them. The impact sent Marcus tumbling further downstream while Jenna found herself partially submerged, fighting to maintain her grip on the slippery rocks. The chaos intensified as more elk entered the water, their heavy bodies creating additional turbulence that made rescue attempts nearly impossible. Ethan fired a second shot, this time grazing the lead bull's flank in a desperate attempt to turn the herd away from the area where Marcus was struggling to surface. The wounded animal bellowed in pain and confusion, its blood mixing with the churning water as it finally reached the far bank. Marcus managed to grab a partially submerged log that had become wedged between two boulders, using it as an anchor while he fought to regain his footing on the treacherous riverbed. His face had turned blue from the cold, and his movements were becoming sluggish as hypothermia began to set in. Jenna, soaked to the skin but determined, worked her way along the bank until she could reach him with a fallen branch. The rescue took nearly 20 minutes of careful maneuvering as both hunters fought against the powerful current and slippery rocks. By the time she managed to pull Marcus from the water, his lips were purple and his hands shook uncontrollably from the extreme cold. Ethan had successfully turned the elk herd downstream, but the animal's passage had transformed the crossing point into a muddy, debris-filled obstacle course. As they helped Marcus strip out of his waterlogged clothes and wrapped him in emergency blankets from their packs, all three hunters reflected on how quickly their routine expedition had transformed into a life-threatening emergency. The combination of rushing water, massive wildlife, and treacherous footing had created a perfect storm of danger that could have easily claimed a life. The bull elk they had been tracking was long gone, but none of them felt any disappointment. Marcus's narrow escape from drowning had reminded them all that survival often depended more on quick thinking and teamwork than on marksmanship or hunting skills. The mountain rapids had claimed their share of lives over the years, and today could have easily added another name to that tragic list. They spent the remainder of the day hiking back to their vehicle, supporting Marcus as he recovered from his ordeal. The failed hunt had become a powerful reminder that nature's most beautiful locations often concealed its deadliest threats. In late September 2019, in northern Maine, the dense wilderness stretched endlessly beyond the small hunting cabin that Lucas Brandt and Emil Carver had rented for their annual moose hunting expedition. This remote region, located nearly 40 miles from the nearest town of Greenville, represented some of the most pristine moose habitat in North America. Lucas Brandt, a 42-year-old insurance adjuster from Portland, had been planning this hunting trip for over a year. His .300 Winchester Magnum represented a significant investment for someone who typically hunted white-tailed deer on smaller parcels of land closer to civilization. This expedition into Maine's deep woods marked his first serious attempt at pursuing the giant bulls that could weigh nearly half a ton when fully mature. His hunting partner, Emil Carver, brought 38 years of experience and a .308 Ruger that had proven effective on everything from black bears to trophy elk during his adventures throughout the Northeast. Emil's knowledge of moose behavior during the rutting season made him an ideal guide for Lucas, who was still learning to distinguish between the various calls and signs that indicated the presence of mature bulls in the area. The cabin itself was a modest structure built from local timber in the 1960s, designed to accommodate hunters and fishermen seeking temporary shelter in the remote wilderness. Its single room contained 2 bunk beds, a wood-burning stove, and basic storage for hunting equipment and supplies. The walls, constructed from pine logs chinked with mud and moss, had weathered decades of harsh Maine winters but had never been tested against the raw power of an enraged moose. The 2 hunters had spent the morning tracking fresh sign along a series of beaver ponds where moose typically fed on aquatic vegetation. They had heard the distinctive grunting calls of bulls establishing territory, but the thick forest and shifting wind had made it impossible to pinpoint exact locations. After several hours of careful stalking that yielded only distant glimpses of brown shapes moving through the undergrowth, they had returned to the cabin for a midday meal and rest period. Emil was preparing coffee on the small camp stove while Lucas cleaned his rifle and reviewed topographical maps that showed the network of logging roads and game trails in the surrounding area. Both men were discussing their afternoon strategy when the first sounds of approaching danger reached their ears. A deep, rhythmic thumping seemed to emanate from the forest itself, growing steadily louder as something massive moved through the trees. The bull moose that emerged from the forest measured nearly 7 feet at the shoulder and carried antlers spanning over 5 feet across. Its massive frame, weighing approximately 1,200 pounds, represented the peak of evolutionary development for North American wildlife. During the rutting season, bulls like this one became unpredictable and aggressive, driven by hormones and territorial instincts that could transform them into living battering rams. The animal had been spooked by distant gunshots from other hunters in the area, sending it into a panic-driven charge through the forest. Its poor eyesight, combined with the cabin's location directly in its escape route, created a collision course that neither the hunters nor the moose could have anticipated. The bull's momentum carried it forward at nearly 30 miles per hour as it crashed through the final stand of saplings separating it from the cabin. The impact against the cabin's north wall sounded like a freight train derailment. Pine logs that had stood firm for over 50 years splintered like matchsticks as the moose's massive shoulders struck the structure. The entire building shuddered, sending pots and pans crashing from their shelves while dust and debris filled the air. Lucas grabbed his rifle and fired at point-blank range, the bullet grazing the bull's massive shoulder but failing to slow its destructive rampage. The wounded moose, now even more enraged, used its antlers like a bulldozer blade to tear through the cabin's interior. Emil found himself pinned beneath a fallen support beam as the animal's hooves trampled their equipment and supplies. The moose's antlers became entangled in their backpacks and sleeping gear, causing the massive animal to thrash violently as it attempted to free itself from the foreign objects. This created additional chaos as the bull's powerful neck muscles sent debris flying in all directions, further damaging the cabin's interior and threatening both hunters with flying splinters and metal fragments. Lucas managed to drag Emil from beneath the fallen timber while the moose continued its destructive struggle with the tangled equipment. Blood from the shoulder wound was making the animal increasingly desperate, and its efforts to escape were systematically destroying what remained of the cabin's structural integrity. The roof began to sag as supporting posts shifted under the assault. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of destruction, Lucas managed to position himself for a clear shot at the bull's chest. The .300 Winchester Magnum's heavy bullet found its mark, and the massive animal staggered backward through the destroyed wall. After a moment of confused standing, the wounded moose retreated into the forest, leaving behind a scene of utter devastation. Both hunters survived the encounter with deep bruises, cuts from flying debris, and a profound respect for the destructive power of Maine's largest wildlife. The cabin would require complete reconstruction, but they had learned that even temporary shelters could become death traps when 1,200 pounds of panicked moose decided to change direction. In late September 2016, in Primorsky Krai, Russia, the vast Siberian taiga represented one of Earth's last remaining strongholds for the legendary Amur tiger, also known as the Siberian tiger. This remote wilderness, stretching across thousands of square miles near Russia's border with China and North Korea, contained some of the most challenging hunting terrain on the planet. Dense stands of Korean pine and Mongolian oak created a forest canopy so thick that even experienced hunters could become disoriented within minutes of leaving marked trails. The region's history was steeped in tales of massive tigers that had ruled these forests for centuries, apex predators capable of taking down brown bears and surviving harsh winters that would kill most other large carnivores. Viktor Kuznetsov, a 41-year-old forestry worker from Vladivostok, had obtained special permits to hunt red deer in this carefully regulated territory. His .338 Winchester Magnum, topped with a loopholed 4 to 12 times scope, represented the culmination of years of saving and preparation for this once-in-a-lifetime expedition into tiger country. Victor understood the risks involved in hunting where Siberian tigers maintained active territories, but the opportunity to pursue red deer in their pristine habitat had proven irresistible. The morning had begun with perfect conditions for tracking. A light fog clung to the forest floor, muffling sounds and creating an otherworldly atmosphere among the towering pines. Fresh deer sign was abundant, with tracks, droppings, and feeding areas indicating a healthy population of red deer moving through the area. Victor had been following a well-used game trail for over 2 hours, noting the various sizes of hoofprints that suggested both mature stags and does with fawns. The forest's silence was broken only by the occasional call of ravens overhead and the distant sound of wind moving through the high branches. Victor moved carefully, placing each step deliberately to avoid snapping twigs or disturbing the thick carpet of fallen spruce needles that covered the forest floor. His breath formed small clouds in the cold air as he paused frequently to scan the surrounding vegetation for any sign of movement. What Victor failed to notice was the massive predator that had been paralleling his movement for the past 20 minutes. The Siberian tiger, a 500-pound male in his prime, had initially been attracted by the scent of the red deer herd that Victor was tracking. However, the tiger's keen senses had quickly identified the human intruder, and its hunting instincts had shifted focus to this potential threat in its territory. The ambush came with the explosive speed that made Siberian tigers the most feared predators in the taiga. The massive cat erupted from dense undergrowth, barely 15 feet away, its powerful muscles propelling nearly a quarter-ton of apex predator directly toward the unsuspecting hunter. Victor's peripheral vision caught the flash of orange and black stripes just as enormous paws struck the ground where he had been standing moments before. Training and instinct caused Victor to swing his rifle around and fire at point-blank range, the .338 Winchester Magnum's heavy bullet striking the tiger's left shoulder. The impact would have dropped most animals immediately, but the massive Siberian tiger barely staggered, its thick muscle and bone structure absorbing the powerful round without losing momentum. The wounded predator used the dense forest to its advantage, disappearing behind fallen logs and low-hanging branches before launching a second attack from a different angle. Victor fired again, this time striking the tiger's chest, but the animal's rage and territorial instincts drove it forward despite the serious wounds. Massive claws raked across Victor's heavy jacket, tearing through the thick material and grazing his arm before he managed to leap over a fallen tree trunk. The third encounter occurred as Victor attempted to retreat to higher ground where his rifle might provide better defensive positioning. The tiger, bleeding but still incredibly dangerous, made one final charge that forced Victor to scramble up a steep, rocky outcropping while firing his remaining ammunition. The combination of difficult terrain and the predator's injuries finally convinced the massive cat to withdraw into the fog-shrouded forest. Victor spent the next 3 hours treating his wounds and waiting for any sign that the tiger had truly departed before beginning his careful retreat toward the nearest road. His encounter had lasted less than 5 minutes, but it had provided a vivid demonstration of why Siberian tigers remain the undisputed rulers of the taiga, capable of turning any hunting expedition into a desperate fight for survival. In September 2017, in the Kodiak archipelago of Alaska, the islands contained some of the most remote and challenging wilderness in North America. This rugged chain, dominated by the massive Kodiak Island itself, served as home to the largest brown bears on Earth. Lucas Harding, a 33-year-old commercial fisherman from Anchorage, had traveled to Kodiak Island during his off-season to pursue small game hunting in areas where few humans ever ventured. His 12-gauge pump-action shotgun was loaded with heavy buckshot, suitable for grouse, ptarmigan, and the occasional rabbit that inhabited the island's interior forests. Lucas possessed extensive experience with Alaska's wilderness, having spent over a decade working on fishing boats in some of the state's most remote waters. The morning had begun with typical Kodiak weather, thick fog rolling in from the ocean and settling among the towering Sitka spruce that dominated the coastal forest. Visibility fluctuated between 20 and 50 feet as Lucas worked his way along what appeared to be an old game trail winding through the dense undergrowth. The forest floor was carpeted with a thick layer of moss and fallen needles that muffled his footsteps but also concealed the uneven terrain that made walking treacherous. Lucas had been following fresh grouse sign for over an hour, noting the distinctive scratches in the soft earth where the birds had been feeding on fallen berries and insects. The trail led gradually upward through increasingly steep terrain, where massive granite outcroppings created natural barriers and hidden ravines that could appear suddenly through breaks in the fog. The first indication of danger came as an overpowering stench that cut through the clean forest air. The smell of rotting flesh was unmistakable, suggesting that a large carcass was decomposing somewhere nearby. Lucas recognized this as a potential sign of bear activity, since Kodiak bears often cached kills or fed on marine mammals that had washed ashore along the island's extensive coastline. As he moved cautiously forward, trying to identify the source of the smell, Lucas discovered the partially consumed remains of a harbor seal that had apparently been dragged inland from one of the hidden coves that dotted Kodiak's rugged shoreline. The carcass showed clear signs of being claimed by a large predator, with massive bite marks and claw gouges that could only have been made by one of the island's legendary Kodiak bears. Before Lucas could retreat from the feeding site, the fog parted momentarily to reveal a massive brown shape moving through the trees less than 30 yards away. The Kodiak bear that emerged from the mist stood nearly 4 feet at the shoulder, even on all fours, with a massive head and powerful limbs that spoke of a lifetime spent dominating this harsh island environment. At approximately 1,200 pounds, this particular bear represented one of the larger specimens that had made Kodiak Island famous among wildlife enthusiasts worldwide. The bear's reaction to discovering a human near its cached food source was immediate and violent. A thunderous roar echoed through the forest as the massive predator charged forward with surprising speed for such a large animal. Its powerful legs propelled the enormous bulk across the uneven terrain with fluid grace, closing the distance between predator and prey in seconds. Lucas fired a warning shot from his 12-gauge, the sharp crack echoing off the surrounding granite walls. But the massive bear showed no signs of slowing. The animal's territorial instincts had been triggered by the presence of an intruder near its food source, and 12-gauge buckshot would require perfect placement to stop such a determined charge from an animal of this size. Panic and survival instincts caused Lucas to stumble backward as he attempted to reload and prepare for a second shot. His heel caught on a hidden root system, sending him tumbling toward what he had assumed was simply a gentle slope leading down into a shallow depression. Instead, he found himself falling toward the edge of a steep ravine that had been completely concealed by the thick fog and overhanging vegetation. The hidden gorge dropped nearly 20 feet before narrowing into a series of cracks and crevices carved by centuries of erosion. Lucas managed to catch himself partway down the slope, wedging his body into a narrow gap between granite walls that was barely wide enough to accommodate his shoulders. The 12-gauge clattered down into the darkness below, leaving him defensively positioned, but essentially unarmed. Above him, the frustrated Kodiak bear paced along the rim of the ravine, its massive paws occasionally sending small rocks cascading down toward Lucas's hiding place. The animal's enormous head appeared periodically over the edge as it attempted to reach the human who had suddenly vanished from view. Massive claws scraped against the granite walls, leaving deep gouges in stone that demonstrated the incredible strength contained within those seemingly clumsy paws. The standoff continued for nearly 3 hours as Lucas remained motionless in his rocky shelter while the bear gradually lost interest in its unreachable quarry. The fog continued to roll through the forest, occasionally obscuring the ravine completely before lifting to reveal the massive predator still patrolling the area above. Lucas could hear the animal's heavy breathing and occasional huffs of frustration as it investigated the various scents and sounds around the hidden gorge. Eventually, the bear's attention was drawn away by some disturbance deeper in the forest, possibly another animal or the sound of distant human activity. Lucas waited an additional hour before attempting to climb out of the ravine, using roots and rock protrusions to slowly work his way back to ground level. His body was bruised and scraped from the fall, and his hands shook from a combination of adrenaline and cold that had penetrated his clothing during the long wait. When he finally emerged from the forest several hours later, Lucas carried with him a profound respect for the power of Kodiak bears and an understanding that survival in Alaska's wilderness often depended more on luck and terrain than on firearms or hunting skills. The hidden ravine had saved his life, demonstrating that sometimes the best defense against nature's largest predators was simply knowing when and where to disappear. In December 2020, in northern Montana, the rugged mountain ridges had earned their reputation as some of the most challenging hunting terrain in the continental United States. This particular wilderness area, located near the Canadian border where the Rocky Mountain front met endless stretches of high prairie, represented a landscape shaped by centuries of harsh weather and dramatic elevation changes. Ancient glacial activity had carved deep valleys and exposed granite ridges that rose nearly 2,000 feet above the surrounding forest, creating a maze of steep slopes and hidden ravines where mule deer sought shelter during the brutal winter months. Samuel Hayes, a 36-year-old rancher from Great Falls, had ventured into this demanding environment during the final week of Montana's extended hunting season. His .300 Winchester Magnum, equipped with a Leupold 4 to 12 times scope, had proven effective on numerous mule deer over the years. But this particular expedition represented his first attempt at hunting in such extreme conditions during the depths of winter. Samuel's experience with livestock and outdoor work had prepared him for harsh weather, but nothing could fully prepare someone for the sudden fury of a Rocky Mountain blizzard. The day had begun with deceptively calm conditions as Samuel hiked along a well-defined ridge that offered excellent visibility across the surrounding valleys. Fresh mule deer tracks in the light snow indicated that several animals had passed through the area during the previous night, likely moving between feeding areas in the lower elevations and bedding sites among the rocky outcroppings higher up the mountain. Samuel had been following the tracks for nearly 3 hours when he spotted a small herd of mule deer picking their way across a distant slope. The animals appeared to be moving steadily upward, suggesting they might be seeking shelter from weather that Samuel had not yet recognized as approaching. His attention was focused entirely on the deer as he calculated range and wind conditions for a potential shot. The blizzard arrived with the sudden violence that characterized Rocky Mountain weather systems. Within minutes, clear skies transformed into a whirling mass of snow and wind that reduced visibility to less than 10 feet. The temperature plummeted rapidly as Arctic air swept across the exposed ridge, turning the light morning snowfall into a life-threatening storm that would dump over 2 feet of snow before morning. Samuel immediately recognized the danger of his exposed position on the narrow ridge. The wind, now gusting over 50 miles per hour, threatened to knock him from the treacherous footing while the driving snow made navigation nearly impossible. He began working his way downward toward a stand of lodgepole pines that might provide some shelter from the worst of the storm's fury. The descent proved far more treacherous than anticipated. Ice had formed beneath the fresh snow, creating a slippery surface that sent Samuel sliding uncontrollably down steep sections of the ridge. His rifle, essential for both hunting and protection, became difficult to manage while maintaining balance on the increasingly dangerous terrain. After several frightening falls, he managed to reach the relative shelter of the pine forest. As darkness began to fall, bringing with it even more severe cold, Samuel heard the first signs that he was no longer alone in the forest. Low growls and the sound of branches snapping under heavy weight indicated that a pack of wolves had detected his presence and was beginning to investigate. The combination of deer scent on his clothing and his obvious vulnerability made him an attractive target for predators that had learned to take advantage of winter's harsh conditions. The wolf pack consisted of at least 6 animals, their presence revealed by the occasional glimpse of gray shapes moving through the storm and the sound of communication calls that carried over the wind. Samuel fired a warning shot into the air, the sharp crack of his .300 Winchester Magnum echoing across the frozen landscape. But the wolves seemed undeterred by the noise. Their hunting instincts had been triggered by the scent of potential prey trapped in the storm. Desperate for shelter that would provide defensive advantages, Samuel began digging frantically into a snowdrift that had accumulated behind a fallen tree. His hands quickly became numb despite his insulated gloves, but he managed to create a shallow trench that would conceal most of his body while allowing him to keep his rifle positioned for defense. The wolves circled his position throughout the night, their yellow eyes occasionally visible as brief reflections in the swirling snow. Samuel could hear their heavy breathing and the sound of paws crunching through the deep drifts as they tested different approaches to his improvised shelter. Several times he detected movement close enough that he could have reached out and touched the nearest animal, but the combination of wind and darkness made accurate shooting nearly impossible. The siege continued for over 8 hours as Samuel fought against hypothermia while maintaining constant vigilance against the patient predators. His fingers became so numb that operating the rifle's bolt action required tremendous concentration, and ice crystals formed in his beard and eyebrows despite the protection provided by his winter gear. The wolves seemed content to wait, understanding that the storm was working in their favor by weakening their trapped quarry. Dawn brought a gradual lessening of the wind and snow, though the temperature remained well below zero. As visibility slowly improved, Samuel discovered that the wolf pack had finally retreated, leaving behind only tracks and the memory of their haunting presence during the longest night of his life. His survival had depended on the fallen tree that provided both shelter and defensive positioning, along with enough ammunition to convince the wolves that easier prey could be found elsewhere. The trek back to his truck required most of the day, as Samuel struggled through waist-deep snow while following landmarks that were barely recognizable after the storm's transformation of the landscape. His experience had taught him that Montana's wilderness demanded respect for both its weather and its predators, either of which could prove fatal to unprepared hunters.